Is Brian Eno, the man himself, really the beginning of all ambient music? My name is Phil. I make ambient music by the name Left the Chat. I'm a former librarian, but once a librarian, always a librarian. So I am going to run this book club. Welcome back to Ambient Book Club. We are on episode 3, chapter 3 of 20th Century Ambient by Dusty Henry, part of the 33 and a third genre series. We are finally getting to the moment we've all been waiting for, the dawn of ambient. Up until now, we've been talking about the Big Bang all the way to the 1970s, before we had this term, ambient music, and everything that led up to that moment. And the moment that we are talking about, that this chapter dives into deeply, is Ambient 1, Music for Airports by Brian Eno, which, if anyone is listening to this podcast, they probably have already heard this name, probably have already listened to this album, and probably understand that this is credited as the beginning, maybe the first album under the umbrella of ambient music. But is that really fair to say? Is Brian Eno himself really fair to be credited with an entire genre based on one album? And Dusty Henry points out right off the bat that Eno himself pushes back on this idea. The idea of genius, the idea of any idea that grabs hold of a culture originating in one man, kind of seems ridiculous when you pull it apart and really analyze it. Now, in preparation for this episode, I have been watching all of the Brian Eno interviews that I can get my hands on YouTube. And Brian Eno himself brings up this idea in nearly every interview that I've seen of him, where he credits not genius, not the brain of one man as the start of anything, but this term that he has coined, Scenius, where the scene itself is where the genius originates, where it comes from. And I really resonate with this. I honestly didn't like the idea of Brian Eno very much at first when I first heard him as being repeatedly credited with this entire genre, starting with him. Because I have a strong aversion to any type of hero worship, any type of self made man rhetoric. I personally bump up against any time someone is too high on their own horse and doesn't credit the people around them for the success which they should all be sharing. And it seems like maybe the Scenius idea is always present and always true when new ideas emerge into the wider culture, but that the story is easier to tell if you grasp onto one person, one name, one project within that scene, and you tell the story from the perspective of that person, and then that person goes on to get credit for the entire scene. And I think Brian Eno is nobly pointing that out every time he is credited with the invention of ambient music. He's pointing out that for some reason culture latched on to his album when really there was a large scene happening of which he was partaking, of which he was gathering ideas from and putting ideas back into. And for some reason, his project is the one that floated to the top and got the credit in history, the credit commercially, and that much of that is just luck. So I was ready to dislike Brian Eno. But the more that you watch interviews with him and the more you see his philosophy, and he does think about art in a deeply philosophical way, the more I just clicked with him, the more I thought, not that this guy's a genius, but that I'm glad that he has a platform. Because there's a lot of people whose microphones reach a lot of ears who don't have anything to say of interest. And Brian Eno is not one of those people. He deserves to be heard. So with all that being said, let's get into the 1970s. Let's get into Brian Eno. And let's dive into ambient music when the term was coined. Now, this guy is really famous. He has bumped shoulders with and collaborated with a lot of really famous people. I was watching one interview. I believe it was Red Bull Music Academy's interview with him from a few years back. And they play a Coldplay song for him. And he says something about how that's a really beautiful song, and he can't for the life of him remember what his contribution to it was. And that the only reason he knows that he co-wrote it is because it says so. And I love this. He's such a prolific artist. He wakes up every morning and makes art. He talks repeatedly about how he has thousands and thousands of projects saved on his computer that will just never be released. Because that's how much he works and that's how much he creates. And he doesn't linger on something that he just released. He moves on. He moves on to the next thing. He keeps trying to innovate, keeps trying to create. And when you work that often and you make it your life, you can get a lot of collaborations in the number of years that he's been doing it. So chances are very good that you, without knowing it, have heard Brian Eno's work. Now, he first started in the early 70s in a UK rock group playing synthesizer called Roxy Music. And Roxy Music is an interesting classic rock style band, very of its time, good music, and definitely unique for its time, probably because of Brian Eno's synthesizer work in the background. But he leaves this band pretty early on. And around this time in 1973, he hooks up with the guitarist of a band called King Crimson, Robert Fripp.
I think this is a very brave thing the producers of this show are doing.
Now, guitarists will recognize Robert Fripp's name as the originator of Frippertronics. And this is a type of guitar technique that a lot of us use, especially ambient musicians, where we use a looper or a delay. And we play one phrase or maybe a pedal tone that goes on indefinitely or for seconds or minutes. And then we play something else over the top of it. But no one was doing this in the 70s. And this originated with both Eno and Robert Fripp. And they used this technique on two albums, 1973's No Pussyfooting and 1975's Evening Star. And I could listen to both of these albums over and over again. Robert Fripp goes on to do Frippertronics for many years in live scenarios and on TV. And the tone of his guitar is just beautiful and unique and very in your face, but somehow still zen-like, hypnotic, and ambient. So if you've heard the term frippertronics and you've seen all the YouTube videos of how to do frippertronics, but you've never gone to listen to Robert Fripp, you might want to check out a video or two of him playing. So in 1975, Brian Eno also releases an album called Discrete Music. And it's with Discrete Music where Eno really hones in on the idea of trying to make music that is so in the background that it becomes almost inaudible. And there's a quote in the book that comes from the liner notes of the album where he says, "I was trying to make a piece that could be listened to and yet could be ignored. Perhaps in the spirit of Satie, who wanted to make music that could mingle with the sound of the knives and forks at dinner." And over again, when you hear about Eno, you will probably run into some version of the quote that he wanted to make music that can be listened to just as easily as it can be ignored. And Dusty Henry describes discrete music as a piece that's sublimely monotonous, and I think that's a wonderful description of it. After discrete music, Eno works alongside David Bowie. And during their work together on the album Low, Eno begins to work on his side project, which would eventually become Music for Airports. He also releases an album with the German group Cluster, called Cluster and Eno. Which relies heavily on tape loops and heavily processing audio electronically, and you really start to hear the sounds of ambient taking shape. But it was in 1978 when we get Ambient 1, Music for Airports. And this is it. This is the beginning of ambient music according to history and the internet. So we're finally here, the dawn of ambient. And it's a great album. It really is one of the best. If you haven't heard it or you've been avoiding it, you should go check it out. Listen to it in its entirety. You can listen to it while doing other things, or you can sit down with headphones, close your eyes, and really try to listen to it. I think it works both ways, and I think, as Eno said, that's what he set out to do. Create an album that was as easily ignored as it is listened to. The reason that the album is Music for Airports is Ryan Eno had a little bit of a fear of flying, and he didn't appreciate that there was almost no thought going into the music being played at the airport while you're waiting to get on what is actually a very scary journey if you spend any time thinking about it. And he was hoping for music that would be a little bit more contemplative than, I think he said that there was German disco music playing when he first had this epiphany. So he set out to make an album of music that really allowed someone to sit into the gravity of the situation that is flying on a commercial flight. So the album is at the same time peaceful as it is maybe very introspective. And I think he even says Here, really, it's music to resign you to the possibility of death. So there's a lot going on with the concept of the album. But if you listen to it, it is pure tranquility. The album features piano, and the album features tape loop technique, the album features vocals. But none of these things are being used in the more traditional sense. There's no time signature or tempo to grab onto. It's an ethereal ride that stretches from beginning to end, but it's a smooth ride. At no point are there loud bangs or surprises. There's nothing to grab your attention unless you're willingly giving it. And I think that's what makes it special, and I think it's what many ambient artists are still striving for, is to create music with no sharp edges. That doesn't mean no tension, that doesn't mean no discord, but there's just no sharp turns. You can see every move that's about to be made coming before it happens. Nothing's jarring. And even the most discordant moments can still be felt as tranquil and beautiful. So if you're one of the few people who hasn't heard Ambient 1, Music for Airports by Brian Eno, stop what you're doing, turn this video off, and give it a listen. Turn it on in the background while you do the dishes. Throw it on in your headphones. Tell me what you think about it. But Music for Airports is not the only ambient album made by Brian Eno. It's probably not even the best one. It's not even the only one in this series. It's called Ambient 1 for a reason. There's Ambient 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in Ambient 2, Brian Eno finds himself working with Harold Budd. Now, Harold Budd was a composer and a fan of minimalist music. He was a fan of John Cage and the avant-garde, and he experimented with the Buchla synthesizer, releasing a drone piece for his first recorded album in 1970 called The Oak of the Golden Dreams. But it was his composition called Madrigals of the Rose Angel that caught the attention of Gavin Bryars, who was working with Brian Eno at the time. So Eno learns of Harold Budd and invites him to come work in Eno's studio on his next album, which becomes Pavilion of Dreams. Pavilion of Dreams is beautiful and ambient in its vibe. It has harp and saxophone and glockenspiel. It has instruments that maybe more traditional composers would think to use. And that's what makes it unique and worth listening to. But after Pavilion of Dreams, Eno asks Harold Budd if he'll work with him on the next Ambient series album, Ambient 2, The Plateau of Mirror. Ambient 2 might be my favorite of the four. it has more to grab onto in a traditional sense. Because Harold Budd is playing piano like a pianist might play, not someone who is really interested in warping sound and making noises, but someone who wants to play piano more traditionally. And then Eno is taking that signal and doing what he does to it to make it ambient. But there are moments where there's actual tempo and time signature to grab onto. And this album is something that you can show to anyone, no matter their interest or lack thereof in ambient music. And I think they'll just see it as beautiful piano music and not even recognize the techniques or the electronic sounds going on underneath it. So if you enjoyed music for airports at all, I would recommend giving The Plateau of Mirror a chance and maybe seeing what you decide, listening to the differences and listening to what it sounds like when Eno works alone versus when he works with a collaborator. Which will lead us to Ambient 3 when he works again with a collaborator named Laraji. But that will be when we enter chapter 4 and we look at New Age music. Now, I have a couple of things to say about Eno since we're focused on him in this chapter. Things that are not in the book. The book doesn't mention oblique strategies, where Eno uses this method of writing down ideas, concepts, or even limitations of the music making process onto a deck of cards. And then if he ever gets stuck, he grabs one of the cards out of the deck and uses it as a catalyst to become unstuck and to move on with the project. And it creates a sense of maybe randomness, but maybe some sort of divine intervention. I don't know. Chance. Something outside of yourself. Now, I haven't used this concept specifically in my music, pulling a card, but I do roll dice every time I sit down to play to determine what key I'm going to be in, what mode I might play in. I try to randomize things so that I'm not going back to the same practice techniques that I'm comfortable with, but I'm trying to instead stretch myself and grow. And I've also used the oblique strategies idea in conversation. I bought a deck of playing cards that were blank on both sides, and I used it to write carefully thought out conversation starters and questions to ask people when it feels like the conversation just isn't flowing. I can pull a card randomly and say, hey, I'm not asking, the cards are asking. But since we're here, we might as well both answer it. And it really sparks conversation well. Now, there's multiple documentaries on Eno. The most recent was 2024's Eno. And they use some interesting innovation. Controversial because it's AI. But the idea is the movie is cut up, edited in such a way that AI is able to randomize maybe the order that you see it in, maybe whether you see scenes at all. I'm not sure. I've only seen it once. So I got a certain version of this movie that ideally could never be seen again. I don't know how drastically the experience varies from showing to showing, but the idea that they're playing with the concept of editing film and documentary storytelling is a fun idea. And the documentary that I saw was good and worthwhile and made me like him all the more. One of my favorite albums by Eno, in the same vein as the Ambient series, is called Lux. And I can't put my finger on why this one sticks out to me so much, but I come back to it again and again. And I listen to it more than I do Ambient 1 through 4. And Eno is still making music in this same vein today. If you follow him and subscribe to his YouTube channel, periodically new tracks and new albums pop up. And finally, I most recently watched a YouTube interview where he was on a panel and the conversation was about art and its role in democracy. And given the political landscape that we're in right now, I think it's important that we have these conversations and we talk about not art itself only, but art communities and artists and how we relate to each other, how we protect each other, how we care for each other, and how we band together to pool resources. And Eno talks about how the billionaires have all the money. So what do we have? Well, we have strength in numbers. But that only works if we are collaborating and if we are gathering and if we are creating together. So if you're uncomfortable in the political landscape of today and you're an artist, find other artists and create with them and alongside them. And it's within those art communities that we will find our network of resistance built in to preserve our mental health and our safety and to dream of a better world. Because artists are the dreamers, right? So we need to be dreaming together. Go make music with someone else. That's your homework for this week. Don't always and only make music alone. Thanks for joining me.